Snow crunched softly beneath Alex Carter's heavy boots as he carried another suitcase to the old pickup truck parked on the porch of their suburban Minnesota home. The morning air was crisp in his cheeks, and his breath steamed in clouds, dissolving into the pale gray light that barely filtered through the low clouds. Surrounded by snow-covered spruce trees, the house looked like a postcard, neat, with white siding and warm light pouring in from the windows. But beneath the idyll was a sense of unease today. He and Claire were leaving everything familiar for a 6-month assignment at Northwind Station in the Arctic. Alex glanced up at the second-story window, where he glimpsed Sarah, their eldest daughter. She stood with her forehead pressed against the glass, her dark hair falling over her shoulders, her eyes hard, almost accusing. 16, an age when any goodbye felt like a betrayal. He tried to smile at her, but his lips wouldn't obey, and it came out more like a grimace. Nearby, Claire was checking off a packing list on her tablet, her fingers moving quickly in thin leather gloves, her lips pressed tightly together, a sign that she was trying to keep everything under control. Her brown hair was escaping from under a wool cap, and Alex found himself thinking that even in this cold, she looked like she'd stepped out of a Scandinavian-style magazine. "Did you bring extra batteries for the flashlight?" Claire asked, not taking her eyes off the screen. Her voice was calm but slightly hoarse, the result of a sleepless night spent packing and talking to her daughters. "Yes, Claire, I did. And batteries, and warm socks, and even that hat with the pompon you made me wear last winter," Alex replied, putting the suitcase in the trunk. He wanted his tone to sound light, but there was bitterness in his throat. The last few months of their marriage had been like a taut string, ready to snap at the slightest touch. Claire finally looked at him, her green eyes narrowing. "Don't grumble. It's no laughing matter on the Northwind if you're cold, and by the way, that hat is stylish." "Stylish," he chuckled, rolling his eyes, but the corners of his lips still twitched. For a moment, there was warmth between them, the same thing that once made their evenings cozy, when they laughed at silly TV shows or argued about the color of the living room wallpaper. But the moment passed, and Claire was back to her tablet, as if hiding behind a to-do list. Alex slammed the trunk shut, and the sound echoed down the quiet street, scaring a crow off a neighbor's fence. A dog barked in the distance, and Lizzie, their youngest, called out from the house. "Sarah, give me back my sweater. It's not yours." Alex shook his head, feeling his heart clench. Leaving the girls with Grandma Marge for 6 months had been the only sensible thing to do: school, friends, a normal life. But that didn't make the goodbye any easier. He walked up to the porch where Marge was waiting, wrapped in an old khaki coat, her gray hair pulled back into a neat bun, and her eyes showing the worry she was trying to hide behind a smile. "Are you sure this is right, Alex?" she asked quietly, so the girls wouldn't hear. 6 months in this icy wasteland, and just the two of you." Alex shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, feeling the cold creep under his skin. "Marge, we've discussed everything. This is a chance. For us, for the girls. The money for the project is good. I can finally open my own company. Without loans, without debts." She frowned, her lips twitching, but she didn't argue. "Just take care of her, okay? Claire's strong, but you know what she's been through." He knew. 3 years ago, he'd made a mistake he'd never been able to erase from his memory. One night on a business trip to Seattle, too much bourbon, and a woman whose face he could barely remember now. He'd told Claire himself, unable to bear the silent weight of guilt. She'd said she'd forgiven him. But her forgiveness had been like thin ice, beautiful, but fragile, ready to crack under the slightest pressure. Since then, their marriage had been like an unfinished house. The frame was there, but the warmth was gone. "I know," he answered quietly and entered the house. The room smelled of freshly brewed coffee and the pancakes Marge had baked for their vertical align. Middle party. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, her head glued to her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen as Alex walked in. Lizzie, on the other hand, was chatting away from the windowsill, waving her fork. "Dad, will there be seals up north?" she asked, her blue eyes shining with curiosity. "There might be seals, Liz," Alex replied, sitting down opposite Sarah. But closer to the station, there's only snow and ice and a bunch of scientific gizmos. Boring, Sarah muttered, still glued to her phone. Her voice was laced with sarcasm, which at 16 years old felt like a weapon. Claire walked into the kitchen, pulling off her gloves. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, but her eyes were firm. Sarah, we've talked about this before. It's only 6 months. Granny will be with you and will call every day. Every day, Sarah snorted, finally looking up. As if there's any internet there. It does, Claire said firmly, but there was a hint of doubt in her voice. Satellite. We can handle it. Lizzie jumped off the windowsill and hugged Claire, burying her face in her waist. Mom, will you bring me a snowflake? A big one, like in cartoons? Claire laughed, and her laughter was like a warm ray in a cold room. Snowflakes are melting, honey, but I'll find you something special, I promise. Alex watched them, feeling a longing stir in his chest. Claire was right, this was a chance. Not just for him to earn money to fund his dream of starting his own engineering company, but for their marriage. 6 months of isolation without the usual distractions, work, friends, the hustle and bustle. Maybe out there in the ice, they could finally talk, or at least remember why they had chosen each other in the first place. An hour later, the truck was speeding down the snowy highway toward the Minneapolis airport. Claire sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window at white fields and the occasional frost-covered farmhouse. The radio played something from the 1980s softly, but neither she nor Alex paid attention. The silence in the car was heavy, as if each was waiting for the other to speak first. Thinking about girls? Alex asked, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, but there was tension in it. Claire turned her head, her eyes tired but calm. Always thinking about them, but they'll be fine with Marge. She knows how to handle Sarah. Even with her teenage rebellion, Alex chuckled, but immediately regretted his tone. Sarah was their common pain, too smart, too stubborn, too much like Claire in her youth. She's just scared, Claire said quietly, fiddling with the edge of her scarf. She needs time. And you? The words escaped him before he had time to think about them. Claire paused, her fingers stilled, her gaze returning to the window. Me too, she finally said, so quietly he could barely hear. Alex gripped the steering wheel harder than he needed to. He wanted to say something else, to apologize, to explain that he wasn't the same person who'd stumbled 3 years ago. But the words felt as empty as the snow outside. Instead, he simply reached out and turned up the volume on the radio, filling the silence with a guitar riff. The Minneapolis airport was buzzing despite the early hour. People were lugging suitcases, children were fussy, and a voice was announcing flights. Alex and Claire were at the check-in counter, checking in their bags. They had a long way to go, Minneapolis to Toronto, Toronto to Iqaluit, and then a tiny charter plane to Northwind, lost in the Canadian Arctic. Are you sure you're ready for this? Alex asked as they headed toward the security area. Your favorite coffee shops or fabric showrooms won't be there. Claire snorted, but her eyes warmed. I'm a designer, Alex, not a princess. Besides, I brought my sketchbooks. Maybe Arctic minimalism will be my next project. He laughed, genuinely for the first time that morning. If you start hanging curtains on the antennas, I wouldn't be surprised. Not curtains, she nudged him in the side with her elbow. Acoustic panels, functional and beautiful. They fell silent, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of the car. It was something light, almost familiar. Alex found himself wanting to take her hand, but instead he adjusted the strap of his backpack and walked forward. On the plane to Toronto, they were seated across the aisle from each other, Claire buried in a book, a novel about traveling in Greenland, and Alex stared out the window at the clouds merging into a gray haze. He thought about Northwind, about the project he was about to lead. The old station, built in the 70s, was falling apart under the winds, and the new lab was supposed to be his triumph, proof that he could do more than just work for hire. But deep down, he knew it was about more than just his career. He glanced at Claire, at her concentrated face, at the way she underlined her lines with a pencil, and he thought that this trip was their last chance. Either they found their way back to each other, or everything would fall apart completely. "What are you thinking about?" Claire closed the book and looked at him. "About the station," he lied. "About how to keep the generators from freezing." She smiled, but there was something elusive in her eyes. "You can handle it, Alex. You always can." He nodded, but that familiar heaviness was back in his chest. She believed in him, or at least she said she did. But did he believe they could start over? In Iqaluit, they were greeted by an icy wind that smelled of salt and metal. The airport was small, with colorful posters about the northern lights and polar bears. Claire stopped at one, her fingers brushing the glass. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "Maybe we'll see the aurora." "If it doesn't turn into icicles, we'll admire it for now," Alex answered, but his voice was soft. The charter plane to Northwind was old, with worn seats and a pilot named Dan, who looked like he'd spent his whole life in a cockpit. "The wind's nasty today," he said, grinning. "Hang in there." Claire gripped the armrests as the plane took off. Alex noticed, and without thinking, covered her hand with his. She didn't pull away, but she didn't look at him either. Her fingers were cold, even through her gloves. "Everything will be fine," he said, not knowing who needed it more. She nodded, her gaze directed towards the tiny window where the endless whiteness of the Arctic began. Northwind Station appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a few low buildings surrounded by snow and a single antenna jutting out into the void. The plane landed on a short runway, and they were met by a man in an orange jumpsuit. "Dr. Larson, the station's director." "Welcome to the end of the world," he said with a slight smile. "I hope you're prepared for the cold." Claire and Alex exchanged glances. There was a spark in her eyes, either excitement or challenge. He felt his heart beat faster. This was their new home, their new chance. "We're ready," Claire said, her voice sounding more confident than he expected. Alex picked up his bags and stepped into the snow. Behind them, the plane was already preparing to take off, and ahead lay the unknown, cold, silent, and possibly capable of changing everything. The wind whipped her face like an icy whip as Claire Carter stepped onto the frozen runway of Northwind Station. The plane that had brought her and Alex to this remote Arctic island was already disappearing into the Inkai darkness, its roar fading into the furious howl of the elements. Claire adjusted her scarf, covering her chin, and looked out to the horizon, where the dim lights of the station twinkled like stars fallen on the snow. There was no morning or evening here, only the eternal polar night, squeezing everything around her in its cold embrace. She felt her heart beat a little faster, either from fatigue or from anticipation of something new, unknown. Alex stood nearby, clutching the handles of their bags, his broad shoulders tense under his thick jacket. He nodded to Dr. Larson, their guide, whose face was barely visible beneath his hood. "Where to now?" "The main building," Larson said, his voice cutting through the wind. "It's warm, there's food, and your quarters. But first, meet the crew. They're already assembled." Claire caught Alex's eye. His blue eyes, usually so calm, seemed wary now, as if he were trying to assess what they'd gotten themselves into. She knew that looked the way he looked when he took on a project that seemed impossible. Northwind Station was like that. The ramshackle buildings, decades old, barely holding up under the Arctic storms, and the new lab Alex was tasked with building would test his skills. And maybe their marriage. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the cold bite into her lungs, and followed Larson, her boots sinking into the fresh snow. "Let's exchange stories, right where you are from, and maybe you remember something similar." The main building of the station looked like a fortress. Low, gray, with narrow windows that barely let in any light. But inside it was unexpectedly warm, smelling of coffee and fresh bread, and the walls, covered in light paint, created the illusion of coziness. Claire pulled off her gloves, rubbing her cold fingers, and glanced at Alex, who was taking off his down jacket. His movements were sharp, as if he was trying to shake off not only snow but also fatigue. Larson waved at them, pointing to the corridor leading to the dining room, and Claire felt a knot in her stomach. 20 people with whom they would have to live side by side for 6 months. 20 pairs of eyes that would examine them, evaluate them, judge them. The dining room was spacious, with long tables of dark wood and metal chairs that cracked when someone shifted. On the far wall hung a tattered map of the Arctic, covered with pins and notes, and next to it was a board with a duty roster and the words, "Check your radio before you go out." A space heater hummed in the corner, and from the kitchen came the clink of dishes and the smell of frying meat. The team, exactly 20 of them, was already assembled, some scrolling through clipboards, others finishing their coffee, and 2 men in orange vests arguing over a blueprint. When Claire and Alex walked in, the conversations died down and everyone turned to look at them. Claire felt her cheeks heat up, despite the cold that hadn't yet thawed her. She was used to attention client presentations in Minnesota, had taught her to keep a straight face, but these were different. They were curious, almost predatory, as if each was trying to see if the newcomers would break under the weight of the Arctic winter. "Welcome," Larson began, pulling off his cap and smoothing down his sparse gray hair. "This is Alex Carter, our new engineer. He'll be renovating the old buildings and building a new lab. And Claire Carter, the interior designer, who will hopefully make this place feel a little less like a warehouse." There was a chuckle, and the tension eased a bit. Alex nodded, his voice firm but with a slight smile. "Good to be here. I'll try to keep the walls from cracking and the roof from leaking." "This is already a breakthrough," one of the builders said, and the table burst into laughter again. Claire smiled, but her gaze slid over her face. Academics in thick sweaters emblazoned with university logos, construction workers with calloused hands, 2 security guards in dark jackets, cooks in white aprons smelling of spices, and one guy, sitting by the window, stood out from the crowd. About 28 years old, with blonde hair sticking out from under a baseball cap and a slight smirk that seemed both cocky and attractive. He caught her eye and nodded slightly, as if they were old acquaintances. Claire felt her heart skip a beat and quickly turned away, pretending to adjust her scarf. "Ryan Bennett, geologist," Larson introduced, noticing her gaze. "Our expert on ice and rock. If the ground starts shaking, he'll tell us whether to run or not." "Just don't run my way," Ryan added, his voice low and with a slight southern accent that seemed out of place in this icy wasteland. "I don't like crowds." Claire felt the corners of her lips twitch involuntarily, but she quickly pulled herself together. Alex, standing next to her, said nothing, but she noticed how his hand, resting on the back of the chair, squeezed a little tighter. Larson went on to introduce the others. Dr. Emily Chen, a biologist who studied bacteria in the ice, was a petite woman with a sharp gaze and a habit of adjusting her glasses every 5 seconds. Carl, the lead builder, was a burly Swede with a red beard that seemed to protect him from any frost. The guards, brothers Tom and Dan, looked like they were carved from the same tree, except Dan was slightly shorter and had a tattoo on his neck. The cook, Maria, a woman with a warm smile and wrinkles around her eyes, immediately placed plates of hot stew in front of Claire and Alex. "Eat before it gets cold," she said, her voice soft, almost maternal. "It's cold here if your stomach is empty." Claire thanked him and sat down at the table, feeling the heat from the plate warm her palms. The food was simple but filling, with a hint of herbs that Maria seemed to have brought with her. Alex sat down next to her, his shoulder lightly brushing hers, and for a second the feeling was so familiar, so close, that Claire wanted to linger on the moment. But Larson had already begun to explain the routine: equipment checks, duty shifts, mandatory radio reports. The station lived by a strict rhythm where every minute was subordinated to survival and science. "What about the internet?" Alex asked, pushing away his empty plate. "We were promised a connection to home." Larson winced. "There's satellite communication, but it's finicky. The weather is a hindrance, and the speed isn't good for streaming. You'll be able to call the girls, but don't expect miracles." "Too bad," Ryan said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "I was planning on having a Star Wars marathon." Make sure your lightsaber doesn't freeze, Emily Chen retorted, and the table erupted in laughter again. Claire felt the tension in her chest ease a little. These people, despite the harshness of their lives, were alive with sparks of humor and warmth. But she couldn't help but notice Ryan looking at her again, not insolently, but with a slight interest that made her heart beat a little faster. She looked away immediately, focusing on Al, who was already discussing something with Carl about concrete mixes for the foundation. After dinner, Larson led them to their room. The corridors of the station were narrow, with metal walls covered in peeling paint and the smell of machine oil. The floor vibrated slightly from the generators, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped, creating a rhythm like the ticking of a clock. Claire walked behind Alex, her backpack slapping her back, thinking about how strange it was to be here at the end of the world, with a man she loved but no longer knew for sure. Their room was cramped. Two narrow beds separated by a nightstand, a metal closet, and a tiny window that showed nothing but darkness. Claire threw her backpack on the bed and walked to the window, trying to see something. "The light will start in a couple of months," Alex said, putting his bag down by the wall. "They say the sunrises here are like a painting." "Let's hope so," Claire replied, turning to him. "How do you like the team?" He shrugged, taking off his jacket. "They're fine. Carl seems smart. That's half the battle. What do you think?" "Interesting," Claire said carefully, choosing her words. "Ryan, the geologist, seems to like being the center of attention." Alex froze, hanging his jacket on the hook. "Yeah, I noticed. His jokes are sharp." Claire wanted to ask him what he meant, but decided against it. Instead, she began unpacking, pulling out her sketchbooks and pencils. "Larson said I could do the dining room, maybe add a few touches to make it less gloomy." "Strakov," Alex smiled, sitting down on the bed. "You haven't changed." "Would you like to live in a bunker without a soul?" she retorted, and they both laughed. But the laughter died down quickly, and the room fell silent. Claire looked at her albums, and Alex looked at his hands, as if each was waiting for the other to say something important. But neither dared, and Claire simply said, "I'm going to shower. The journey is exhausting." "Yes, of course," he nodded, and she left, feeling the familiar weight squeezing her chest again. The shower was communal, with gray tiles and a hot stream of water that was a relief after the flights. Claire stood under the stream, closed her eyes, and tried to push away thoughts of Sarah and Lizzie, of home, of what awaited her and Alex here. She wanted to believe that this place would save them. But what if it only deepened the rift that had already split their lives? When she returned, Alex was already asleep, his back to the wall. His breathing was heavy but even. Claire lay down on her bed, looking at the ceiling and listening to the wind hitting the walls. Somewhere in the hallway, a door creaked, and someone's footsteps faded into the distance. Northwind Station lived its own life, and Claire felt that her own peace would be a rare guest here. The morning, or what passed for morning here, began with a shrill beep that made Claire jump out of bed, her heart pounding as she tried to figure out what was going on. Alex was already on his feet, pulling on his sweater. "What is it?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Breakfast," he replied, grinning. "Larson warned me. Everything is on schedule here." Claire exhaled, feeling stupid. "Like in the army." "Welcome to the Arctic," he said, extending his hand to her. The cafeteria was full again, but the atmosphere was businesslike. Maria was handing out bowls of oatmeal and toast, and Larson was handing out assignments. Alex went with Carl to look around the old building, and Claire was asked to join Emily Chen in the lab to discuss ideas for the cafeteria. "Don't expect a palace here," Emily said as they walked down the hall. "But a little something human wouldn't hurt. People get homesick after a few weeks." "I'll think about it," Claire replied, already imagining how to use wood paneling or textiles with simple patterns. The lab smelled of chemicals, and the tables were piled high with test tubes. Ryan Bennett was there, sorting through rock samples. He looked up as they entered and smiled. "Oh, the designer has arrived," he said, putting down the stone. planning on turning this place into a gallery. Only if I find ice paint, Claire replied, trying not to be influenced by his tone. Emily rolled her eyes. Ryan, take care of your rocks. Claire, don't pay attention to him. He's harmless. I'm harmless as can be, Ryan said with a wink and returned to his work. Claire felt her cheeks warming up again and quickly turned back to Emily, asking questions about the lab. But somewhere deep down, she knew Ryan had noticed her reaction, and it scared her. The day passed quickly. Alex returned for lunch, frosted but happy. He told Claire that the old building was worse than expected, but the foundations for the new lab were in place. Claire shared ideas for the cafeteria that she had discussed with Emily and Maria. They chatted at the table, and for a while, everything seemed almost normal. But in the evening, in their room, the silence returned. Claire sat on the bed, leafing through sketches, and Alex checked the plans. The wind roared outside the window, and the station shook under its blows. "Are you okay?" he asked suddenly, without looking up from his tablet. "Yes," she answered, too quickly. "And you?" He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen in a long time. "I'm glad we're here, Claire. I really am." She nodded, but didn't know what to say. Instead, she closed the album and lay down, facing the wall. Her heart was pounding, not with joy, but with fear. They were here, together, at the end of the world. But was it enough to bring back what was lost? The night on the Northwind was alive. The wind howled, the walls cracked, and somewhere in the distance, ice pounded. Claire lay awake, listening to these sounds, and wondered what was coming. About Ryan, whose jokes were too sharp. About Alex, whose guilt still stood between them. And about herself, who she would become in this place where there was nothing but ice and time. The polar night on Northwind was more than just the absence of light. It was alive, tangible, like a heavy blanket thrown over the world. The wind beat against the walls of the station, as if trying to break in, and the darkness outside the windows seemed endless, swallowing up everything that dared to step outside. Claire Carter sat in the dining room, cupping a mug of hot tea in her hands, watching the steam rise, swirling in the dim light of the lamps. It had been a week since their arrival, and although the station was beginning to take on the features of home, Claire still felt like an outsider, a guest in this world of ice and metal. The cafeteria was buzzing, as it always was in the evenings. After their day's work science experiments, construction work, equipment checks, the crew gathered here to stave off the blues. Some laid out cards, others turned on an old projector to watch a movie on a tattered sheet stretched across the wall. Today, Maria, the cook, hummed in Spanish as she set out bowls of popcorn and pitchers of hot cocoa. Dr. Emily Chen and security guard Dan argued over the rules of Monopoly, and Carl, the construction worker, strummed his guitar, tuning it for another attempt at Bob Dylan. The atmosphere was warm, almost familial, but Claire still sat off to the side, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sweater, her gaze wandering around the room. Alex was somewhere in the workshop, immersed in blueprints and reports. Building the new lab had been more difficult than he had expected. The old building was bursting at the seams, and the materials shipped from the mainland were not always up to spec. He came to the dining room only for dinner, ate in silence, and returned to work, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts. She didn't blame him, he was always like this when he took on a project. But the loneliness she felt, sitting amid the laughter and conversation, was acute, almost physical. "Claire, are you in?" Ryan Bennett's voice broke her reverie. He was standing at the board game table, holding a battered copy of Scrabble. His blonde hair was sticking out from under his baseball cap, and his smile was as cocky as ever. "Or are you planning on redoing the entire dining room in your sketchbook again?" She smiled involuntarily, although a twinge of anxiety stirred in her chest. "I don't mind, but I'm not the best word player." "Oh, that's okay," Ryan said, pulling up a chair. "The main thing is to keep Emily from winning. She beats everyone here because she knows words like quasar and entropy." "Those are legal words," Emily said indignantly, adjusting her glasses. "Study, Bennett, instead of whining." Claire laughed, and the tension eased a little. She moved toward the table where Maria, Dan, and Dr. Larson were already gathered. Ryan sat down across from her, his eyes lingering on her for a moment, and Claire felt her cheeks flush slightly. She quickly looked away, concentrating on the letters Dan was handing out on the wooden board. The game was unexpectedly fun. Emily actually used scientific terms, much to Dan's protests that Yeti was a perfectly acceptable word. Maria laughed so hard she nearly knocked over her cocoa, and Larson, usually reserved, teased everyone by spelling out ice and declaring it the most Arctic word. Claire, to her surprise, began to relax. She spelled out warm, earning an approving nod from Ryan. "Not bad, designer," he said, winking. "Maybe you'll warm up the station too?" "Only if I can find fabric that doesn't freeze," she replied, trying to keep her voice light. But his gaze, warm and slightly mocking, made her heart beat faster. When the game was over, Emily had won. Of course, Claire felt like she wasn't thinking about home every second of the day for the first time in a week. But the feeling was as fragile as first ice, and she knew that if she were alone, the longing would return. The next evening, there was a movie in the mess hall. A projector as old as the station itself was showing Alien, and Claire, sitting in her creaky chair, tried not to flinch every time the xenomorph appeared on the screen. Alex was nearby, but his gaze kept wandering to his tablet, where he was reviewing reports. She knew he wasn't doing it on purpose. The construction was consuming him, as always, but that didn't make her loneliness any less acute. "You don't like horror movies?" Ryan asked, plopping down in the chair next to her. He held up a bowl of popcorn and offered her a handful. "Or do you just not want to get eaten in the dark?" "I don't like things jumping out of the dark," Claire admitted, taking popcorn. "You seem to be in your element." "The Arctic is one big horror movie," he said, grinning. "Just without the xenomorphs, I hope." She smiled, but noticed Maria, sitting nearby, glancing at them quickly. Claire sat up straight, feeling caught in something that wasn't there. Or was it? She pushed the thought away and focused on the screen, where Ripley was fighting for her life. After the movie, Alex excused himself and went into the workshop, muttering something about a problem with the generator. Claire stayed in the dining room, helping Maria clear away the dishes. Ryan, to her surprise, stayed behind, collecting empty mugs and joking with Dan about who could survive the longest in a fight with an alien. "Are you okay?" he asked when they reached the sink where Claire was washing dishes. "You look like you're being stalked by a monster yourself." "I'm just not used to it yet," she answered, trying not to look him in the eye. "To the darkness, to the isolation." "It's okay," he said, his voice softening. "The first week is always tough, but you're doing great." Claire nodded, feeling his words warm her despite her attempts to remain indifferent. "Thank you. It's just, Alex is busy, and I haven't found my place yet." "You'll find it," he said, handing her another mug. "In the meantime, if anything breaks the light, the heater, call me. I'm a jack of all trades here." She laughed, and for a second everything seemed easier. But when she looked up, she saw Emily Chen watching them from across the table, her eyebrows slightly raised. Claire quickly looked away, concentrating on washing the dishes, but her heart was beating too loudly. The next few days flowed into a monotonous rhythm. Alex would disappear to the construction site, returning late, with frost in his hair and tired eyes. Claire tried to occupy herself. She worked on sketches for the dining room, discussing with Emily and Maria how to add coziness without spending too much. She suggested using wood paneling from old crates and fabric she found in storage to make curtains. Her ideas were met with enthusiasm, but progress was slow. Materials were limited, and her thoughts kept returning to the house, to Sarah and Lizzie. Ryan, as promised, became her reluctant assistant. When a light bulb burned out in the dining room, he showed up with tools and fixed it in 5 minutes, teasing her as she struggled to hold a stepladder. When she ran out of wood for the heater, he brought an armful, refusing to help. And once, when Claire was trying to figure out how to fix the coffee machine, which refused to work, he simply stood next to her and pressed a few buttons, making it hum again. "You're a lifesaver," Claire said, trying to hide her embarrassment. I just know how important a dose of caffeine is in this icy hell, he replied with a wink. Their conversations were light, but Claire couldn't help but notice the way he looked at her not insolently, but with an interest that made her feel alive. And it was scary. She loved Alex, despite everything that had happened 3 years ago. But his constant absence, his absorption in his work, left a void that Ryan, without knowing it, was beginning to fill. One evening was a turning point. The crew had a musical evening. Carl got out a guitar, Maria brought an old tambourine, and Dan, to everyone's surprise, turned out to have a pretty good voice. They sang everything from old rock ballads to folk songs that Maria knew by heart. Claire sat in the corner, sipping wine from a metal mug someone had brought a bottle, despite the strict station rules. Alex was nearby, but his gaze was again wandering somewhere far away, as if he was mentally checking the plans. Claire, sing something, Maria cried, her cheeks flushed with wine and laughter. Oh no, I don't sing, Claire laughed, raising her hands. My voice sounds like a cat that's been caught in a door. That's not true, Ryan said, sitting opposite with a mug in his hand. Come on, designer, surprise us. Claire shook her head, but under the gaze of the team and the cheers, she stood up. She chose an old song, Hallelujah, that she had sung with Alex on their first date. Carl picked up the melody on his guitar, and Claire began to sing, her voice hesitant but clear. The room fell silent, and even Alex looked up, his face softening. When she finished, there was applause, and Ryan raised his mug in her honor. I told you you could, he said, his smile genuine, without the usual mockery. Claire felt a warmth spread through her chest, but then she noticed Emily's gaze, sitting next to Maria. Her eyes were narrowed, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. Claire sat up quickly, her cheeks flushed, and turned away, pretending to adjust her sweater. Alex, as if sensing something, put his hand on her shoulder. You're great, he said quietly. I haven't heard you sing in a long time. It's been a while since there was a reason, she answered, and her voice was softer than she expected. He nodded, but his hand quickly retreated, and he looked back at his tablet. Claire felt the familiar melancholy return, but now it was mixed with something new, a sense of guilt she couldn't explain. Later, when the evening was over and the team had left, Claire was helping Maria clean up the dining room. Ryan, as usual, stayed behind, collecting empty bottles and folding chairs. They worked in silence, but the silence was comfortable, almost friendly. As Maria walked into the kitchen, Ryan suddenly said, You were a star today. Seriously, Claire, you have talent. It's just a song, she replied, trying to sound casual. Nothing special. Everything you do is special, he said, his voice quieter than usual. He stood closer than he needed to, and Claire felt her breath hitch. She took a step back, her hands hovering over the table. Ryan, I'm married. He raised his hands in surrender. Hey, I didn't mean anything by it. Just a compliment. You're cool, Claire, that's all. She nodded, but her heart was pounding. Thank you, she said, and walked away quickly, feeling the eyes of Maria and Emily, who had returned to the dining room, burning into her back. In her room, Claire lay down on the bed without undressing. Alex was already asleep, his breathing heavy, as if he was carrying the entire weight of the station on his shoulders. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the howling wind, and tried to understand what was happening to her. Ryan was just being friendly, or was he? And why did her thoughts keep returning to him when the man she promised to love for the rest of her life was sleeping next to her? The night on the Northwind was long, and Claire knew the dark days were just beginning. The wind never died down completely on Northwind, but that evening it had become something else, a furious, primal roar that seemed capable of tearing the station apart. Snow slapped the metal walls like pellets, and the buildings shook as if they were alive under the storm. Claire Carter, bundled in a down jacket, made her way from the lab block back to the main building, her flashlight revealing only swirls of snow in the darkness. She had been helping Emily Chen sort samples, but now she wished she had left sooner. Visibility was zero, and the cold was chilling even through 3 layers of thermals. Claire paused, leaning against the wall of one of the storage buildings to catch her breath. Her cheeks were hot from the cold, and her heart was pounding with effort and mild panic. She knew the main building was only 100 meters away, but in this whiteout, 100 meters seemed like an abyss. Her flashlight flickered, and she cursed under her breath. The batteries she'd been checking so carefully seemed to have decided to let her down at the most inopportune moment. Claire? A voice cut through the howling wind, low and familiar. She turned to see a dark figure approaching her. Ryan Bennett, in his signature orange jumpsuit, held a powerful flashlight whose beam cut through the storm like a knife. "What the hell are you doing out here alone?" "I'm going back to the building," she shouted over the wind. "I miscalculated the time." He came closer, his face barely visible under the hood. In this weather, even a polar bear wouldn't stick his head out. "Come on, my house is closer. You can wait out the storm there." Claire started to protest, but another gust of wind nearly knocked her off her feet, and she nodded, clinging to his arm. Ryan led her toward the small building that served as his quarters. Geologists had been given separate modules to work in when they were working with samples. It was cramped inside, but warm. A tiny heater hummed in the corner, rocks and papers piled on the table, and a map of the island covered in notes hung on the wall. Claire pulled at her damp scarf, feeling the blood return to her frozen fingers. "Sit down," Ryan said, gesturing to a chair by the table. "Tea? Or maybe something stronger. I have a bottle of whiskey, but don't tell Larson." Claire smiled weakly, still shaking. "Tea. I don't want to get kicked out for breaking the rules." He chuckled, setting the kettle on the small stove. "Rules don't apply in a storm. The main thing is not to freeze." As the kettle boiled, Claire looked around the house. It was almost Spartan, but there were hints of Ryan's personality. A photograph of a mountain range on the wall, a tattered book about volcanoes, a couple of empty beer cans stacked in the corner. She caught herself trying to piece together an image of the man from these details, and then stopped herself. She belonged with Alex in their room, where he was probably checking blueprints or sleeping, oblivious to the storm. "Here, take this." Ryan handed her a metal mug of steaming tea. His fingers brushed her hand lightly, and Claire felt a jolt run through her skin. She quickly looked away, clutching the mug with both hands. "Thank you," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "I didn't think the storm would be so wild." "This is the Arctic," he said, sitting down opposite with his own mug. "Here, everything is either sleeping or raging. There is no in-between." Claire nodded, looking into her tea. Her thoughts were jumbled, and she wasn't sure if it was the storm or Ryan's proximity. He was too relaxed, too confident, and it was both irritating and compelling. She remembered him fixing the lamp in the dining room, hauling in firewood, winking at her as they played Scrabble, and each time she found herself smiling back. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice quieter, almost intimate. "A week on the Northwind is quite a feat for a newbie." "I try," she said, looking up. He was looking at her, not looking away, and there was something in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. It's all a bit much. The darkness, the cold, the isolation." "Yeah," he nodded. "But you know what helps? Finding something that keeps you in the moment. A joke, a song, good tea." He smiled, and his smile was warm, without the usual mockery. Claire laughed, feeling the tension release. "Are you always so easy?" "Not always," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But here you have to. Otherwise the darkness will eat you." They fell silent, but the silence was not heavy, but warm, like the tea in her hands. The wind roared outside, but the cabin felt cozy, almost safe. Claire talked about her designs for the dining room, how she wanted to add wood paneling and warm colors so that people wouldn't feel like they were in a bunker. Ryan listened, nodding and asking questions, not out of politeness but genuine interest. He talked about his work, how the rocks beneath the ice held millions of years of history, and his voice became animated, almost boyish, as he talked about his findings. "Have you ever seen a meteorite?" he asked suddenly, standing up and rummaging in a desk drawer. A real one, not in a museum. No, Claire replied, intrigued. Do they really fall here? Rarely, but it happens. He took out a small dark stone, smooth, with a metallic sheen, and handed it to her. This one was found last year. Feel it, it's as cold as the Arctic itself. Claire took the stone, feeling its weight and coldness. Their fingers touched again, and she looked up, meeting his gaze. He was close, too close. Time stood still, the storm beyond the walls became distant, and in the cottage there was only this silence, filled with their breathing. Claire, he said quietly, his voice like a touch. You're not like the others. She wanted to respond, to say something witty, to make a joke, but the words stuck. His hand rose slowly, touching her cheek, and Claire felt her body betray her. She knew she should pull away, walk away, but instead she leaned a little closer. Their lips met, first cautiously, almost by accident, and then with a hungry, desperate force, as if they were both searching for something they couldn't find in this icy wasteland. The kiss only lasted a few seconds, but it was like a flash of lightning, illuminating everything Claire had tried to hide. She pulled away, her breath hitching, her eyes wide. I can't, she whispered, standing up so abruptly she nearly knocked over her mug. Claire, wait, Ryan began, but she was already pulling on her scarf, her hands shaking. The storm hasn't. I need to go, she interrupted, not looking at him. She grabbed the lantern and ran out into the storm, not giving herself time to think. Snow lashed her face, the wind tried to knock her off her feet, but Claire kept going, her boots sinking into the drifts. The street lamp flickered and went out, but she could see the lights of the main building. Her heart was pounding, and her head was a whirlwind of terror, guilt, and something else, arousal she didn't want to admit. She kissed Ryan. Claire Carter, who had sworn 3 years ago that she would never be like that woman in Seattle. And yet, that kiss felt real, like for the first time in years she felt not like a wife, not like a mother, but like herself. When she stumbled into the main building, her down jacket was covered in snow, her hair tangled from under her hat. The hallways were empty, the only sound was the hum of the generators. Claire reached their room, her fingers shaking as she opened the door. Alex was asleep, his tablet slung across his chest, his breathing heavy as it always was when he was exhausted. She paused in the doorway, looking at him, and felt tears sting her eyes. He was her husband, the father of her daughters, the man who had once made her laugh until she cried. But now there was a chasm between them, and she had just taken a step that could deepen it. Claire quietly undressed, trying not to wake him, and lay down on her bed. The wind was still howling outside, but it seemed less loud than her own thoughts. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she saw Ryan's face, his smile, his hand on her cheek. And Alex, who was sleeping a meter away from her, unaware that their fragile world had just cracked even more. The storm had died down, leaving behind only a thin layer of fresh snow that crunched beneath her boots and the hollow echo of the wind still echoing in the distance. Northwind Station had returned to its rhythm, the hum of generators, the creak of footsteps in the hallways, the hushed voices in the dining hall. But for Claire Carter, the world was no longer the same. She had spent the previous night awake, lying on her narrow bed and listening to Alex's breathing as he slept a meter away. Her thoughts were a jumble of memories, returning to that moment in Ryan's cabin, to his lips, to the warmth of his hand on her cheek, to the way her body had betrayed her under his touch. She felt torn in two, one part screaming that she had to stop, to go back to her husband, to their life, and the other part the one that had woken up in the storm, whispering that she was alive, truly alive for the first time in years. The morning began with the usual bustle. Claire sat in the dining room, clutching her coffee mug and pretending to listen as Maria talked about a new soup recipe. Alex, as always, had left for the construction site before dawn, or what passed for dawn here, leaving a note on the table. Be back by lunch, checking foundations. Claire looked at the note, written in his neat engineer's hand, and felt something heavy tighten in her chest. She wanted to talk to him, to tell him about the storm, about how she had almost gotten lost in the snow, but the word stuck. What if he asked where she had been? What would she say? The truth was too dangerous, too destructive. "Claire, are you with us?" Emily Chen's voice broke her thoughts. The biologist sat across from her, adjusting her glasses and scrolling through a data tablet. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "Just a storm," Claire replied, forcing a smile. "I'm not used to this." "Oh yeah," Emily nodded, her eyes narrowing as if she'd noticed something but didn't say anything. "The first storm is always nerve-wracking, but you pulled it off." Claire nodded, taking a sip of coffee to hide the trembling in her hands. She could feel Emily's gaze, sharp, almost piercing, and it made her remember the way Emily had looked at her during the musical evening when Ryan had winked at her from across the table. Emily was seeing too much, and it scared Claire. She stood up quickly, muttering something about needing to check her sketches, and walked out of the dining room, her heart pounding. Claire decided to stay away from Ryan. It was the only sensible thing to do. She couldn't afford to be alone with him again, couldn't risk it. But the station was too small, and their paths inevitably crossed. He'd show up in the mess hall, joke with the crew, help Carl carry boxes, or fix something in the lab. Every time their eyes met, Claire felt her resolve melt like ice in the spring. She tried to be cool, distant, keep her answers short and her eyes averted, but his presence was like a magnet, invisible but irresistible. That day, she was working in the warehouse, sorting through fabrics she'd found for her dining room decorating ideas. Larson had given her permission to use old boxes and scraps of material, and Claire threw herself into her work, trying to distract herself. The warehouse was cold, with only a single lamp lit by dim light, but she felt safe here, away from prying eyes and away from Ryan, or so she thought. The door creaked, and Claire jumped, dropping the spool of fabric. Ryan stood in the doorway, his baseball cap pushed back, holding a toolbox. "Larson said there was something wrong with the wiring," he said, his voice light, but his eyes twinkling. "Didn't expect to find you." "I'm just working," Claire said, too quickly, and immediately regretted her tone. She leaned over to pick up the fabric, trying not to look at him. He set the box down and came closer, his boots creaking on the concrete. "You've been avoiding me," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "Since that night in the storm, am I right?" Claire froze, her fingers tightening on the fabric. She wanted to lie, to say he was wrong, but her voice betrayed her. "Ryan, I can't. We shouldn't." "Shouldn't what?" he asked, his voice quieter, almost a whisper. He stopped a step away from her, and Claire felt the warmth of his body despite the cold of the warehouse. "Talk, laugh, or are you afraid of something else?" She finally looked up, and that was a mistake. His gaze was open, without the usual mockery, and there was something in it that made her heart beat faster. "I'm married," she said, but her voice was shaking, and the words sounded unconvincing even to her. "I know," he replied, not looking away, "but I also know that you're here in this cold, looking like you need something you can't find." "Who talks about destruction?" he asked, stepping closer. "Sometimes you just need to feel alive, Claire, even if it's just for a minute." His words hit her like a blow, because they were true. She hadn't felt alive in years, not since she'd found out about Alex's betrayal, not since their marriage had become a series of habits and omissions. She loved Alex, she loved their daughters, but somewhere deep inside, she'd lost herself. And Ryan, with his easy smile and warm gaze, was like a reminder of Claire who'd once laughed without looking back, who dreamed of more than just being a wife and mother. "I don't want to be like that," she said, but her voice was weak, almost pleading. "What?" he asked, his hand moving slowly up to touch her elbow. "A person, Claire, you're not a machine. You're alive." She closed her eyes, feeling his fingers slide over her arm, light but firm. Her body betrayed her, leaning closer, and when she opened her eyes, his face was so close she could feel his breath. "This isn't right," she whispered, but she didn't pull away. "Then tell me to stop," he said, his voice hoarse, almost pleading. "Tell me, and I'll go." Claire opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she stepped forward, and their lips met, not in a stormy way, not casually, but with a hungry, desperate force. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer, and Claire felt her body respond, as if awakening from a long sleep. They backed toward the wall, tripping over boxes, and Claire barely noticed the fabric she was holding fall to the floor. "We need to go somewhere else," she breathed, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and desire. Ryan nodded, not letting go of her. "My house. No one's coming." The geologist's cabin was the same as it had been the night of the storm, cramped, warm, smelling of coffee and metal. But this was different. The door slammed behind them, and Claire felt her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out even the hum of the heater. Ryan didn't give her time to doubt it. He pulled her close, his lips finding her neck, and Claire gasped at the sensation, which was both new and familiar. Her hands slid under his sweater, feeling the warmth of his skin, and he pulled her jacket off, tossing it to the floor. "Claire," he whispered, his voice low, almost growling. "Are you sure?" She looked into his eyes, and in that moment all her doubts, all her guilt, dissolved in what she saw in his gaze, not just desire, but something deeper, something that made her feel wanted, alive. "Yes," she answered, and the word was like jumping off a cliff. They made love right there on the narrow cot, among the scattered maps and stones. It was not tender, not romantic, but fierce, almost desperate, as if they were both trying to wrest something from the cold, endless night. Claire felt his hands, his breath, his body, and for the first time in years, she did not think about being someone else, a wife, a mother, an example. She was simply Claire, the woman who wanted this, who wanted him. When it was over, they lay there, breathing heavily, their bodies still entwined. Claire stared at the ceiling, her thoughts as empty as the snow outside. She waited for the guilt to wash over her like a tsunami, but instead she felt a strange calm. She didn't want to stop this. She didn't want to go back to Claire, who hid her desires for stability. "Are you okay?" Ryan asked, his voice soft, almost cautious. She turned her head, meeting his gaze. "I don't know," she answered honestly, "but I don't regret it." He smiled, his hand sliding over her shoulder. "Good, because I do too." Claire returned to the main building an hour later, her steps quiet but her heart pounding as if she'd run a marathon. She was afraid she'd run into anyone in the hallway, Emily, Maria, Larson, but the station was empty, as if the storm had driven everyone back to their rooms. When she entered his and Alex's room, he was sitting at his desk, hunched over blueprints. His hair was tousled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Where have you been?" he asked, without looking up. His voice was tired, but there was no suspicion in it, only familiar concern. "In the warehouse," Claire lied, her voice even but her inside shaking. "Sorting supplies for the cafeteria." He nodded, not looking up from the drawings. "The storm yesterday was hellish. It's good that you didn't get stuck somewhere." "Yes," she said quietly, taking off her jacket. "Okay." She lay down on the bed, facing the wall, and closed her eyes. Her body still remembered Ryan's warmth, his touch, his voice. She knew she had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. But at that moment, in that cold room, she didn't want to go back. For the first time in years, she felt free, and the feeling was both terrifying and intoxicating. The darkness on Northwind Station wasn't just the absence of light, it was tangible, like cold metal that burned his fingers, like breath freezing in the air. Alex Carter sat at his desk in his room, staring at the blueprint for the new lab, but the lines and numbers were blurring before his eyes. His mind was elsewhere, with Claire, who was late again, somewhere on the station. For the third night in a row, she had returned later than she'd promised, a slight blush on her cheeks and the smell of snow in her hair. She'd say she was working on designs for the mess hall or helping Emily in the lab, but her eyes were avoiding his, and it was like a knife slowly sinking into his chest. Alex leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He knew that fear, that heaviness in his stomach. 3 years ago, he had caused the same pain in Claire. Back in Seattle, one night of whiskey and loneliness had turned their lives upside down. He hadn't planned to cheat, it wasn't in his character, not in his plans. But the woman at the bar, with her easy smile and attentive gaze, had been too close, too accessible. He had told Claire himself, a week later, unable to bear the silent weight of guilt. She had listened in silence, her face motionless as a mask, but her eyes, those same green eyes he loved, had darkened with pain. She had said she forgave him, but since then their marriage had been like a bridge held together by rusty bolts, still standing, but creaking with every step. Now, sitting in the room with the heater humming and the wind howling outside like a wounded animal, Alex felt that bridge cracking again. But this time he was not the culprit, but the victim. Or was it just paranoia? He knew how easy it was to see what wasn't there, especially when the guilt of the past still burned inside. He stood up, pacing the room, his boots creaking on the metal floor. He needed to talk to Claire, but every time he tried, the words stuck like snow in the cracks of the station. The morning began with the familiar signal that woke the station. Claire was already on her feet, standing in front of the mirror and braiding her hair. She looked calm, almost serene, but Alex noticed how her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her sweater. "You're early today," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Back to the lab?" "Yes," she said without turning around. "Emily asked me to help with the samples, and then I'll start sketching the dining room. Larson wants me to show him the plans by the end of the week." "You work hard," he said, and there was a note in his voice that he hadn't expected, a mixture of concern and suspicion. Claire froze for a second, her hand hovering on the door handle. "It's better than sitting around doing nothing," she replied, her tone light, but with just the slightest bit of tension. "See you at lunch." Of course, he nodded, but she was already gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume, something with lavender notes that he had once given her for their anniversary. Alex stared at the closed door, feeling a lump growing in his chest. He knew he had to trust her. She was here, at the end of the world, with him, for their family, for their future. But her absence, her evasive answers, her gaze that now so rarely lingered on him, all of it was like signals he couldn't ignore. He remembered how Claire had changed 3 years ago after his confession. She had become quieter, more withdrawn. Her smiles had become less frequent, their conversations shorter. They had worked on it, seen couples counselors, and promised each other a new start. But now, in this icy desert, he felt them drifting apart again, and this time he wasn't sure who was to blame. The cafeteria was noisy as always. Maria was handing out plates of eggs and toast. Carl was arguing with Dan about whose turn it was to wash the dishes, and Emily was scrolling through her tablet, muttering something about bacteria in ice. Claire was in the corner, hunched over her sketchbook, her pencil moving quickly, sketching. Alex sat across from her, setting his coffee mug on the table. "How are things at the construction site?" she asked without looking up. "Slowly," he replied, sipping his coffee. "The foundation is cracking, the materials are delayed. But Carl knows his stuff, so we'll manage." "Okay," she nodded, her voice even, almost mechanical. "You always do well." He wanted to say something else, to ask why she had come home so late yesterday, but instead he just looked at her. Her face was focused, but there were dark circles under her eyes that weren't there before. He remembered her singing Hallelujah at the musical, her voice shaking but so alive. He'd felt then that maybe they could still get back to what they had been. But now, looking at her, all he saw was a wall invisible, but solid. Ryan walked into the dining room carrying a crate of rock samples. His baseball cap was pushed back, and his usual smirk was on his lips. "Good morning, team," he said, setting the crate down on the table. "Who wants to see a million-year-old chunk of ice?" "Only if it has whiskey in it," Dan said, and everyone laughed. Claire looked up, her eyes meeting Ryan's for a second, and Alex felt his stomach clench. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but he saw her cheeks flush slightly, her eyes quickly dropping back to her sketches. Ryan, still smiling, walked over to her desk, peering over her shoulder. "Not bad, designer," he said, pointing to the sketch. "Are these curtains made of snow?" "Only on paper for now," Claire replied, her voice light but slightly trembling. "But if I find a way, Larson will be delighted." Ryan laughed, and his hand briefly touched her shoulder, a gesture that might have been friendly, but that felt like an electric shock to Alex. He gripped his mug so tightly his knuckles turned white. He knew that gesture, knew that warmth in his voice. 3 years ago, he had been like that, easy, confident, talking to that woman in Seattle. And now, looking at Ryan, he saw himself reflected back at him, a man who destroyed everything without thinking. "I'll go," he said abruptly, standing up. "I need to check the generators." Claire looked at him, her brows furrowing slightly. "Already? You haven't finished eating." "Later," he said without looking at her, and left the dining room, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. The day passed in a frenzy of work. Alex dug into plans, checked concrete mixes, and argued with Carl about deadlines. Work was his sanctuary, a place where he could drown out his thoughts. But even amid the hum of tools and the crunch of snow underfoot, he couldn't shake the image of Claire and Ryan. He remembered her laughing at his jokes, the way her eyes lit up when he spoke. This wasn't what he and Claire had been like, even in the best of times. Or had he simply forgotten what it was like? He returned to the dining room at lunchtime, hoping Claire would be there, but her seat was empty. Maria, noticing his glance, shrugged. "She went to the lab with Emily," she said, setting a bowl of soup in front of him. "She said she'd be there until the evening." "Thank you," Alex muttered, but his appetite was gone. He ate mechanically, listening to Carl talk about the foundation problems, but his mind was elsewhere. He remembered Claire sitting in their Minnesota house after he told her about the affair. She wasn't screaming, she wasn't crying, she was just looking at him, her hands clutching the edge of the table, her voice cold as ice. "How could you?" she'd asked, and the words still echoed in his head. He'd promised her he'd do anything to earn her trust back. But now he felt that trust slipping away, and he didn't know how to hold on to it. That evening, the station reassembled in the dining room. Someone turned on an old space movie, but Alex couldn't concentrate. Claire appeared an hour later, her hair slightly disheveled and her cheeks flushed. She sat next to him, but her gaze was absent-minded, as if she were somewhere else. "She was in the lab for a long time," he said, trying not to sound like an accusation. "Yes," she said, fiddling with the edge of her sweater. "Emily found something interesting in the samples. I helped her with her notes." "Interesting," he said, but his voice was strained. "You spend a lot of time there." She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "You spend a lot of time at the construction site. That's our job, Alex." "I know," he said, the words cutting into his throat. "It's just, are you okay? You seem distant." Claire froze, her fingers tightening around her mug of tea. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was too even, as if she'd been rehearsing the line. "Just tired. This darkness, it's exhausting." He nodded, but he didn't believe it. He wanted to ask where she really was, why her eyes were avoiding him, why her voice sounded like she was hiding something. But instead he just said, "Okay, if anything, I'm here." She smiled, but it was as tight as thin ice. "I know," she said, and turned back to the screen where the astronauts were fighting something in space. The night brought more doubts. Alex lay on his bed, listening to Claire breathe in her sleep. Her breathing was uneven, as if she were in a restless dream. He remembered how 3 years ago, after his confession, she had stopped sleeping next to him. She had moved into the spare room, and every night he had lain alone, listening to the silence of their home. Back then, he had thought it couldn't get any worse. But now, on Northwind, he felt like it was happening again, only this time he didn't know how to stop it. The next day, he noticed Claire was late again. She said she was going to the warehouse to get fabric, but it was 2 hours before she returned, her jacket covered in snow and her eyes shining as if she had just laughed. Alex wanted to ask where she had been, but instead he went to Larson to check the duty log. He knew it was low, that it looked like surveillance, but he couldn't stop himself. The log said Claire had been in the lab with Emily, but Emily had returned to the main building an hour early. He stood in the hallway, clutching the magazine, and felt his heart clench. He remembered the way Claire had looked at him after he cheated on her, the way her voice had trembled when she asked him why he had done it. He hadn't known what to say then, because he hadn't understood it himself. Now he looked at her empty seat at the table and felt like the answer was out there, but he didn't want to see it. That evening, there was a card game in the dining room. Claire sat next to Emily, but her gaze kept drifting to Ryan, who was joking with Dan and dealing cards. Alex watched them, his hands gripping the cards so tightly they bent. He saw Ryan lean toward Claire, whispering something, and she laughed, her laugh light, almost carefree. It was the same laugh she had when they first started dating, when they were dancing in the Minnesota rain or arguing about what movie to watch. "Your move, Alex," Carl said, nudging him with his elbow. "Oh yeah," he muttered, throwing the card down on the table. But his mind wasn't on the game. He was looking at Claire, at her smile, at her hands that so rarely touched him now, and at Ryan, whose ease and confidence were a mirror of his own guilt. When the game was over, Claire stood up, saying she was going to bed. Alex wanted to follow her, but instead stayed behind, helping Maria clear the table. He didn't know how to start a conversation, how to ask about what was bothering him. He was afraid of the truth, but even more afraid of being left in the dark. "Are you okay, Alex?" Maria asked, her voice soft, but there was something in her eyes that made him wary. "Yes," he lied. "I'm just tired." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on him a little too long. "Sometimes the darkness plays tricks on us," she said quietly. "Makes us see things that aren't there, or not see things that are." He didn't answer, but her words were like a blow. He knew she was right, but he also knew his suspicions weren't just imagination. Claire was slipping away from him, and he didn't know how to keep her. That night, he lay awake, listening to the wind beat against the walls. Claire was asleep, her face calm, but Alex could see her fingers flexing slightly, as if she were holding something in her sleep. He wanted to wake her, to ask what was going on, but instead he just watched, feeling his heart break. He had betrayed her 3 years ago, and now maybe she was betraying him. But that wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt the most was that he didn't know how to fix it, and he was afraid it was too late. The darkness on the north wind was more than a curtain blocking the light. It was a mirror reflecting back every fear, doubt, and secret. Alex Carter could feel it seeping into him, settling in his chest like a cold, heavy weight. It had been almost a month since they had arrived on the station, and with each passing day he felt more and more like Claire was slipping away from him, like sand through his fingers. Her smiles were becoming less frequent, her answers shorter, her absence more noticeable. She would say she was busy decorating the mess hall, meeting with Emily in the lab, or sorting materials in the warehouse, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else behind those words, something he was afraid to say out loud. The morning began with the usual rhythm. A shrill alarm woke the station, and Alex, as always, was the first one up. Claire was still asleep, her face calm, but even in her sleep her brows were slightly furrowed, as if she were struggling with something invisible. He looked at her, trying to remember the last time he had seen her truly happy. Not the forced smile she had given him in the dining room, but the one that lit up her face when they danced in their Minnesota living room, or when she laughed at Lizzie's jokes. Now this Claire seemed distant, almost unreal, like a mirage in this icy desert. He dressed quietly, trying not to wake her, and headed to the workshop. Work was his sanctuary, a place where he could drown out the thoughts of their marriage falling apart. But even the blueprints for the new lab he spent hours studying couldn't drown out the voice in his head that whispered that he was losing her, and that maybe he deserved it. At lunchtime, Alex walked into the dining room, hoping to find Claire, but her place was empty. Maria, passing out plates of hot stew, caught his eye and shrugged. "She went into storage with Ryan," she said, her voice neutral, but there was a shadow in her eyes that Alex couldn't help but notice. "Something's wrong with the lighting," he said he'd fix it. "Thanks," he muttered, his stomach churning. He sat down at the table, but the food tasted bland, and the conversations of the crew Carl, Dan, Emily were background noise. Ryan. Ryan again. The guy was everywhere, fixing lamps, hauling firewood, cracking jokes in the mess hall, and Claire was always there. Alex tried to convince himself it was a coincidence, that he was seeing threats where there weren't any. But the memory of Seattle, of his own mistake, made his suspicions even sharper. He knew how easy it was to cross a line, how quickly one night could ruin everything. After lunch, he decided to check the warehouse himself. Not to spy on Claire, or so he told himself, but to make sure the wiring was okay. The warehouse was cold, dimly lit, and empty. Neither Claire nor Ryan were there. Just frost-covered boxes and the skeins of fabric Claire was sorting for her sketches. Alex stood in the middle of the warehouse, his breath billowing in the air, and felt like an idiot. He wasn't a spy, not a detective. He was an engineer who should be building labs, not hunting for evidence against his wife. But as he turned to leave, his gaze fell on a small plastic crate in the corner, containing a flash drive labeled Northwind Photos. He didn't know why he'd picked it up. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was some instinct he couldn't explain. He pocketed the flash drive and went back to the workshop, where he plugged it into his laptop. Dozens of photos appeared on the screen: snow-covered island landscapes, the team at dinner, Carl with his guitar, Emily at the microscope. Alex flipped through them, barely looking, until he came across one that made his heart stop. The photo was of a dining room, lit by warm lamps. The crew was seated at tables, some laughing, some holding mugs. But in the corner, almost at the edge of the frame, stood Claire and Ryan. They were too close, his hand on her shoulder, her face turned toward him, a small smile Alex hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't a clear sign, not a kiss or a hug, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. He zoomed in, taking in their postures, their looks. This wasn't just friendly contact. It was more. Alex leaned back in his chair, his hands shaking. He wanted to close the laptop, throw away the flash drive, forget what he'd seen. Instead, he opened another folder, the one that held the surveillance footage. The Northwind had cameras in the hallways and common areas, a security measure to track who was coming and going, especially in a storm. Larson had given him access to the footage to check for missing materials from the warehouse. Now Alex was using that access for something else. He scrolled through the footage from the last few days, his fingers moving quickly, almost feverishly. Most of the footage was boring: people walking down hallways, Carl hauling boxes, Maria carrying pots. But then he found what he was looking for or dreading finding. The footage from last night, the hallway leading to the warehouse. Claire and Ryan were walking together, their steps quick, as if they were in a hurry. They stopped at the warehouse door, and Ryan said something, his hand brushing her elbow. Claire laughed, her head leaning closer to his, and then they walked inside. The camera didn't show what happened next. The warehouse was out of view. But they didn't emerge until an hour later, and Claire looked different. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a flush on her cheeks that couldn't just be from the cold. Alex stared at the screen, his breathing heavy. He replayed the footage again, then again, as if hoping the picture would change. But it didn't. Claire and Ryan, together. Too close. Too long. He closed the laptop, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to burst into Claire's room, to ask her, to shout, to demand the truth. But something inside him stopped him. He knew what it was like to be guilty. He knew how his own confession had destroyed her 3 years ago. And now he was afraid that the truth he would find would be even worse. The evening in the dining room was noisy as usual. The team was playing cards, someone was playing music on an old radio, Maria was pouring hot chocolate. Claire was sitting in the corner, leafing through her sketchbook, but her eyes kept drifting to Ryan, who was joking with Dan as he dealt the cards. Alex watched her from the sidelines, his coffee long gone cold. He saw her smile when Ryan said something funny, her fingers fiddling with her pencil, her eyes avoiding his. It was like blow after blow, each one driving a nail into his heart. "Alex, are you with us?" Carl asked, nudging him with his elbow. Or are you back in your blueprints? No, I'm just thinking, he replied, forcing a smile. But his voice was hoarse, and Carl frowned, but didn't press the issue. Claire stood up, saying she was going to the warehouse to get fabric. Alex felt his throat tighten. He wanted to follow her, but instead he sat there, his fingers wrapped around his mug. A few minutes later, Ryan stood up too, muttering something about checking equipment, and walked off in the same direction. Alex stared at the empty door, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the music. He knew he should do something, say something, ask something, stop something. But instead he just sat there, feeling his world crumble. When Claire returned, her cheeks were pink and her eyes were shining. She sat down next to Alex, her hand brushing his by accident, but he pulled away as if her touch had burned. She looked at him, her brows furrowed. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but slightly worried. "Yes," he lied, not looking at her. "I'm just tired." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on him a little longer than necessary. "Are you sure? You seem distant." He wanted to laugh, but instead he just shrugged. "You're the one who's distant, Claire." Her face tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she opened her sketchbook and began to draw, her pencil moving quickly, almost furiously. Alex stared at her, trying to find in her face the Claire he knew, but saw only a stranger. He wanted to ask what was happening, wanted to shout that he knew what he saw, but the words stuck like ice in his throat. At night, he lay awake, listening to Claire breathe in her sleep. He thought about the photograph, the camera footage, the way her laughter had sounded when she was with Ryan. He thought about Seattle, how he had broken their trust. Claire had forgiven him then, but he knew that forgiveness had been as fragile as the first snow. Now he felt like she had crossed the same line, and it was worse than he could have imagined. He wanted to hate her, he wanted to hate Ryan, but instead he hated himself for not being able to hold her, for not being able to be what she needed. Alex turned to the wall, his hands clenched into fists. He wouldn't tell her what he knew. Not now. He would stay silent, like she had stayed silent 3 years ago when he'd told her. But with each passing day, he felt himself drifting further away from her, their marriage becoming an empty shell, and he didn't know how to stop it or if he should even try. The darkness of Northwind Station wasn't just outside the windows, it seeped into the walls, into the words, into the silence. Alex Carter felt it, like cold sweat running down his back, every time he looked at Claire. It had been a month since he'd found that damned flash drive with the photo of Claire and Ryan standing too close, and the security footage of them disappearing into a warehouse, laughing as if no one was watching. He hadn't said a word to her, but every look she gave him, every movement she made, was like salt in an open wound. He knew she knew that he knew, or at least suspected. But neither of them dared speak, and the silence had become their own war-cold, silent, but destructive. The morning began with a familiar alarm tearing through the silence. Claire was already on her feet, standing in front of the tiny mirror, brushing her hair. Her movements were quick, almost mechanical, as if she were afraid to linger in the room longer than necessary. Alex lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, his hands clasped behind his head. He could have asked where she was going, but instead he just watched her pull on her sweater, her fingers shaking slightly as she tied her shoes. "Are you going to the lab again today?" he asked, his voice even but with a sharp edge he couldn't hide. Claire froze, her hand frozen on the cord. "Yes," she said without turning around. "Emily asked me to help with the notes. Are you at the construction site?" "Where else?" he said, and there was a sarcasm in his tone that he immediately regretted. But Claire didn't answer, just nodded and left, closing the door a little too loudly. Alex was left alone, listening to the hum of the heater, feeling his chest tighten with anger and pain. He wanted to shout after her, to ask why she was lying, why she was spending so much time with Ryan, but the words stuck like ice in his throat. He knew that if he started, everything would fall apart, their marriage, their life, their hope that Northwind would be their new beginning. The cafeteria was, as always, the heart of the station. The smell of coffee and freshly baked bread mingled with the hum of voices, the creaking of chairs, and the clink of dishes. Alex sat at the table, mechanically picking at his oatmeal, his gaze fixed on Claire, who sat in the corner with Emily, leafing through her sketchbook. She looked focused, but Alex noticed how her eyes kept drifting to the door, as if she were waiting for someone. And when Ryan walked in, carrying a case of samples, her face brightened for a second before she quickly looked away. "Good morning, team," Ryan said, his voice light, as if he didn't notice the storm brewing in the room. "Who wants to see a piece of granite that's older than the dinosaurs?" "Only if he makes me coffee," Maria said, and everyone laughed except Alex. He watched Ryan set the box down on the table, his hand accidentally or not grazing Claire's shoulder as he passed. She didn't pull away, just smiled slightly, and it was like a punch to the solar plexus. Alex gripped the spoon so tightly that the metal bit into his palm. He wanted to get up, to leave, to do anything to avoid having to see this, but instead he sat there, his face set in stone. Carl, sitting next to him, noticed his tension and nudged him with his elbow. "Hey, are you okay? You look like you swallowed a nail." "It's fine," Alex lied, forcing a smile. "I'm just thinking about the foundation. I need to recalculate the loads." Carl nodded, but his gaze was skeptical. "If anything, tell me. The darkness is crushing everyone here." Alex didn't answer, his eyes returning to Claire. She was laughing at something Emily had said, but her laugh wasn't the same as before. It was forced, like she was acting. Or was he seeing what he wanted? He didn't know. All he knew was that every smile she gave Ryan was like a knife twisting in an old wound. Claire could feel Alex's gaze without even looking at him. It was like a cold wind that cut through her, despite the warmth of her sweater. She knew he was noticing her absence, her evasive answers, her nervousness. She could see it in the set of his lips, in his jerky movements, in the way he barely touched her anymore. But she couldn't speak, couldn't ask him what he knew, because that would mean confessing. Admitting what had happened in Ryan's cabin, confessing that she hadn't stopped, that she hadn't left, that she hadn't said no. She had crossed a line, and now every step she took was like walking on thin ice, ready to crack under her weight. She tried to stay away from Ryan, but the station was too small, and he was too persistent. He would find her in the lab, in the warehouse, in the cafeteria, always with a small smile and a joke that made her heart beat faster. She hated herself for the way her body responded to his gaze, for the way his voice stirred something in her that she had long since buried. But most of all, she hated herself for not being able to stop. Every time she told herself that this was the last time that she would return to Alex, to their life, she would find herself in his arms, and it would start all over again. Today, she was sitting in the lab, helping Emily sort test tubes. Emily was deep in her notes, her glasses slid down her nose, but Claire felt the biologist watching her. Emily had always been too perceptive, and Claire was afraid she noticed more than she was letting on. "You seem a little distracted today," Emily said, not looking up from her tablet. "Is everything okay?" "Yes," Claire answered, too quickly. "It's just, the darkness is pressing." Emily looked at her, her gaze sharp as a scalpel. Darkness or something else? Claire swallowed, her fingers tightening around the test tube. "What do you mean?" Emily shrugged, but her eyes never left Claire. "I just noticed you were spending a lot of time with Ryan. And Alex, he looks like someone punched him." Claire felt her cheeks heat up. She wanted to argue, to tell Emily that she was wrong, but the words stuck. Instead, she just nodded and turned back to the test tubes, her hands shaking. Emily didn't continue, but her silence was louder than any words. That evening, the cafeteria was buzzing again. The team was playing Monopoly, and Dan's laughter echoed around the room as he tried to convince everyone that his strategy was unbeatable. Claire sat next to Maria, her sketchbook open but not drawing. Her gaze kept drifting to Ryan, who was sitting in the corner, lazily shuffling cards. He caught her eye and smiled, and Claire quickly looked away, feeling her heart clench. Alex came into the dining room later, his face tired and his hair frosted. He sat off to the side, not joining the game, just staring into his coffee mug. Claire wanted to go up to him, to say something, but his coldness stopped her. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, but his every gesture was an accusation. When Maria suggested he play, he shook his head, his voice sharp. Not today. Lots to do. You're always busy, Maria said, trying to lighten the mood. Give yourself a break, Alex. I'll take a break when the lab is ready, he said, his gaze flickering to Claire for a second, sharp as a blade. She felt her breath hitch, but he had already turned away, staring at his clipboard. Claire wanted to get up, to leave, but she remained seated, her fingers clenched around her pencil. She knew he suspected. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in his silence, in the way he now avoided her touch. But she couldn't speak, couldn't ask, because that would mean opening Pandora's box. And she wasn't prepared for what might come out. Later, when the team had dispersed, Claire stayed behind to help Maria clean up the dining room. Ryan, as usual, lingered behind, collecting empty mugs. He joked with Maria, but his gaze kept returning to Claire, and she felt her skin burn under his gaze. When Maria went into the kitchen, he came closer, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Are you okay?" he asked, setting the mugs on the table. "You look like you're being haunted." "I'm just tired," she lied, not looking at him. "A lot of work." "Yeah," he said, and there was a hint of mockery in his voice. "The job. Or your husband, who looks at you like you stole his plans." Claire's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Don't say that," she hissed. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know," he said, his voice growing serious. "I see the way he looks at you, and the way you look at him. Something's wrong, Claire, and I'm not stupid enough not to know it has something to do with me." She opened her mouth to protest, but the words didn't come. Instead, she simply shook her head and walked over to the sink, her hands shaking as she began washing the dishes. Ryan didn't follow her, but she could feel his gaze burning into her back. In the room, Claire lay down on the bed, fully dressed. Alex was already there, sitting at the table, leafing through the blueprints. He didn't look at her, didn't say a word, but his silence was louder than any scream. She wanted to speak, to ask what he knew, but fear paralyzed her. What if he'd seen the photo? What if he'd checked the cameras? She knew the station was full of eyes, not just human ones, but electronic ones. And if he knew, why didn't he say anything? That was the worst of it, his silence, his coldness, his caustic glances that cut her like blades. "You're late today," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost lifeless. "Warehouse or laboratory?" "Warehouse," she answered, her voice hoarse. "I was sorting fabrics." He nodded, not looking up from the drawings. "You spend a lot of time there. With Ryan." Claire felt her heart stop. She opened her mouth to protest, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "Don't, Claire. I don't want to hear it." She fell silent, her hands clenched into fists under the blanket. She wanted to scream that he was wrong, that nothing had happened, but the lie was stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply turned to the wall, her breathing ragged. Alex was silent too, and the silence between them was like an abyss into which they were both falling. The night on the North Wind was endless. The wind howled outside the windows, the walls cracked, and the generators hummed like the heart of the station. Claire lay awake, listening to Alex toss and turn in his bed. She knew he was awake, that he felt the gap too. But neither of them made a move to bridge it. And with each passing day, this Cold War grew colder, taking with it the last hope that they could return to each other. Spring on Northwind was not like the spring Claire Carter knew in Minnesota. There were no babbling brooks, no green buds on the trees, no birds singing. Instead, the darkness of the polar night was slowly receding, giving way to a dim, gray light that barely penetrated the low clouds. The ice on the island was beginning to melt, turning the snow into a muddy mess, and the station was preparing to close. With 6 months of isolation coming to an end, the crew was packing up, checking their equipment, and preparing to return to civilization. But for Claire and Alex, the return was more than just a change of scenery. It was the final test of a marriage that was already hanging by a thread. Claire stood in their room, folding clothes into a suitcase. Her movements were slow, almost cautious, as if she were afraid to upset the delicate balance she and Alex had maintained for the past months. The Cold War between them hadn't ended, it had simply died down, like a storm that passes, leaving destruction in its wake. They barely spoke, their conversations limited to short sentences about business. The construction site, her sketches for the dining room, calls to Sarah and Lizzie. But every look, every silence was laced with pain, guilt, and unspoken accusations. Claire knew Alex suspected her connection to Ryan. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in his cold, distant responses, in the way he now avoided her touch. And she couldn't blame him, she had crossed a line she had promised never to cross. But now, as Claire packed her things, she felt a spark of hope. Civilization, their home in Minnesota, their daughters, it all seemed like a chance to start over. She imagined them sitting around the kitchen table, like old times, and talking. Not about Ryan, not about Seattle, but about how they still loved each other, despite everything. She'd forgiven him 3 years ago when he'd confessed to cheating on her, and now she hoped he could forgive her. Or at least that they could put all of this behind them, out here on the ice, and get on with their lives. Did you get everything together? Alex's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, his down jacket covered in frost, holding a folder of blueprints in his hands. His face was tired, but his eyes were as cold as the Arctic wind. Almost, Claire replied, trying to speak softly. And you? Is the construction finished? As much as possible, he said, his voice even but with a slight edge that cut her like a knife. The lab is ready. The next team will do the rest. Claire nodded, her fingers hovering over the zipper of her suitcase. She wanted to say something else, to ask how he was, but his gaze stopped her. He looked at her like he could see right through her, and that was worse than any scream. The plane leaves in 2 hours, he said, turning toward the door. Don't be late. Alex, she began, but he was already gone, leaving only a cold draft behind him. Claire clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to run after him, but instead she just kept packing, her movements becoming jerky, almost furious. She didn't know how to break through this wall he'd erected, but she hoped that at home, among the familiar walls and the voices of their daughters, everything would change. Iqaluit Airport was as small and bustling as they remembered. The Northwind crew was milling around the check-in counter, dropping off bags and exchanging jokes. Maria was hugging everyone, promising to send her soup recipe. Carl was strumming air guitar, and Emily was scrolling through her tablet, as usual, mumbling about bacteria. Ryan was there, wearing his signature baseball cap, but he kept his distance, his eyes avoiding Claire. She was grateful for that every glance from him was a reminder of what she had done, something she couldn't undo. Alex stood by the window, looking out at the runway where their charter plane to Toronto waited. His shoulders were tense, his hands in his pockets. Claire walked up to him, her heart pounding. Alex, she said quietly, we'll talk when we get home, right? About everything. He turned his head, his eyes cold as ice. What exactly, Claire? He asked, his voice so low she could barely hear it. She swallowed, her throat dry. About us. About what happened here. I want us to start over. He looked at her, and there was something in his gaze that made her heart clench, a mixture of pain, anger, and weariness. Again, he repeated, as if tasting the word. Okay, let's talk. But he turned away, and his silence was louder than any words. Claire felt her hope cracking like thin ice beneath her feet. She wanted to say something else, but the voice on the speakers announced landing, and the crew moved toward the plane. On the plane, Alex was silent. He sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the endless whiteness below, though the clouds hid everything but a gray haze. Claire sat next to him, her hands clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. She tried to speak, to ask about something insignificant, the weather in Toronto, whether he thought Marge and the girls would meet them, but each time her words hung in the air like steam in a cold station corridor. Alex answered briefly, monosyllabically, or not at all. His silence was like a wall, and Claire didn't know how to break through it. She thought back to their flight on Northwind 6 months ago, how he had covered her hand with his as the plane shook. She had felt then that they were still together, despite everything. Now his hand lay on the armrest, still as stone, and Claire hesitated to touch it. She looked out the window, where the clouds were merging into a gray haze, and thought about how everything had changed. She wanted to believe that things would be different at home, that they would be able to talk, but his silence was like a harbinger of a storm, and she was afraid that this storm would be the last. Minneapolis greeted them with gray skies and sleet that melted onto the asphalt. The airport was full of people, voices, bustle, and Claire felt her chest tighten with relief and anxiety at the same time. Home, they were finally home. Marge was waiting at the gate, her gray hair pulled back into a neat bun, her eyes shining as she hugged them. Sarah and Lizzie rushed toward them, their voices mingling in a joyful hubbub. Mom, Dad, Lizzie clung to Claire, her blue eyes shining. Did you see the seals and the aurora? We saw the aurora, Claire smiled, hugging her daughter, and the seals seemed to have hidden. Sarah stood slightly to the side, her arms crossed, but her gaze softened as she looked at her parents. Are you okay? She asked, her voice quieter than usual. I'm fine, Alex said, his voice firm, but Claire saw his hand curl into a fist. What about you, Sarah? Fine, she replied with a shrug, but she hugged him, and for a second his face softened. Claire looked at them, tears stinging her eyes. This was her family, her home, her life. She wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that they could leave Northwind behind like a bad dream. But Alex's eyes, cold and distant, told her it wouldn't be that easy. The house in suburban Minnesota was just as they'd left it. White siding, snow-covered spruce trees, the smell of the coffee Marge had brewed for them. Lizzie chartered away, talking about school, the neighbor's new puppy, how Sarah had tried to teach her to skate. Sarah was quieter, but her presence was warm, almost reassuring. Claire sat on the couch with her arm around Lizzie, feeling her heart melt a little. But Alex was different. He helped Marge with the dishes, answered the girls' questions, but his movements were mechanical, his smile forced. When their eyes met, he looked away, and Claire felt her hope melt away like the snow outside her window. That night, after the girls had gone to bed and Marge had gone to her room, Claire found Alex in their bedroom. He was standing by the closet, pulling out clothes and putting them in a suitcase. His movements were fast, almost frantic, as if he wanted to get it over with. Alex, she said, her voice shaking. What are you doing? He didn't stop, continuing to fold shirts. Packaging, he replied, his voice as cold as the Arctic wind. I'm filing for divorce, Claire. Her heart sank as if someone had turned off the light. She took a step toward him, her hands shaking. Divorce? Alex, what are you talking about? We just got back. We can fix this. He finally turned to face her, his eyes dark and full of pain and anger. Fix it, he repeated, his voice low, almost a growl. You think I don't know, Claire? I saw you with him. In the picture. On camera. I know what you did. Claire felt her legs buckle. She wanted to lie, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was a bone in her throat. Alex, I didn't mean to, she whispered, her voice hoarse. It was a mistake. I love you. I forgave you back in Seattle. Why can't you forgive me? He laughed, but it was a bitter, empty laugh. Forgive, he said, his voice shaking with suppressed anger. Do you think I can't see how you've changed? You forgave me, Claire, but you never forgot. And I lived with that every day for 3 years. I thought Northwind would be our chance, but you did the same thing I did. Only worse, because you knew how much it hurt. I didn't mean to, she repeated, tears streaming down her cheeks. I was lost, Alex. You were so far away, always with the plans, always at the construction site. I felt alone. Alone, he stepped toward her, his face twisted in pain. And me? Do you think it was easy for me? I worked to give us a chance, so we could start our own company, so our girls could be proud of us. And you found solace with that, geologist. Claire closed her eyes, her hands clenched into fists. It wasn't comfortable, she said, her voice weak. I don't know what it was, but I know I love you. I want to be with you, with the girls. We can fix this. He shook his head, his eyes empty. I know my worth, Claire, he said quietly. I can't live with this. I can't look at you knowing you were with him. I tried, believe me. But every time I close my eyes, I see you together, and it kills me. She took a step toward him, her hand reaching for his, but he drew back as if her touch had burned. Alex, please, she begged. For Sarah, for Lizzie. We can. Not for the girls, he interrupted, his voice firm. They deserve the truth, and so do I. I'm filing for divorce, Claire. This is the end. He closed the suitcase, his movements sharp, final. Claire stood there, her tears flowing silently, her chest constricted with pain. She wanted to scream, to plead, but she knew it was useless. She saw it in his eyes, his decision, as cold and unchangeable as the ice of the north wind. Alex picked up his suitcase and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the quiet of the house. Claire fell onto the bed, her body shaking with sobs. She remembered their wedding, their first dance, Sarah's birth, Lizzie's laughter. She remembered forgiving him 3 years ago, holding his hand despite the pain. But now he didn't want to hold hers. And she didn't know how to live with that, how to live without him, without their family, without what she had destroyed with her own hands. Minneapolis was bathed in an autumn haze, with the maple leaves turning crimson and the air cool with the smoky flavor of neighbors' fireplaces. Claire Carter sat in the kitchen of her house, which now seemed too big and too empty. The table where she and Alex had once sipped their morning coffee and discussed their weekend plans was covered in papers. Divorce papers, Sarah and Lizzie's school schedules, electric bills. She stared at them, her fingers playing with the rim of her cold tea, and felt her heart tighten at the silence that was now her constant companion. The divorce had been finalized 2 weeks ago, and though the signatures on the papers were dry and formal, each one had left a deep, jagged scar on her soul. Sarah and Lizzie were home, but their presence was a shadow. Sarah, 15 years old and sharp-eyed, spent most of her time in her room, buried in her phone or books. Lizzie, still clinging to her 11 years, was softer, but even she kept her distance, her questions about her dad less frequent, her hugs shorter. Claire knew they blamed her. Not directly, not out loud, but she saw it in their eyes, in their silences, in the way they closed off when she tried to talk about what had happened. Alex had told them the truth, not all of it, not about Ryan, but enough for them to know that their family had been torn apart for a reason. Claire didn't blame him for it. She had destroyed their world, and now she had to live with the consequences. The first weeks after returning from the Northwind were like navigating a minefield. Claire tried to reconnect with the girls, to fill the emptiness of their home with warmth. She baked their favorite chocolate cupcakes, took Lizzie skating, and helped Sarah with her literature essay. But her every gesture was met with wariness. Sarah, who had always been closer to her father, looked at Claire with a cold detachment, her answers monosyllabic, her gaze evasive. Lizzie, more open, sometimes forgot herself, laughed at Claire's jokes, but then, as if remembering something, she withdrew, her smile fading. "Why did Daddy leave?" Lizzie asked one evening as they sat at dinner. Her voice was quiet, almost pleading, and her eyes were shining with tears. Claire froze, her fork hovering over her plate. She wanted to lie, to say something soft, soothing, but the truth was too hard to hide. "We, Dad and I couldn't be together," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes adults make mistakes, Lizzie, and those mistakes, they change everything." "Did you make a mistake?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp as a blade. She sat with her arms crossed, her dark hair falling over her face, hiding her eyes. Claire swallowed, her throat dry. "Yes," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I did, and I'm so sorry." Sarah stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't care," she said, and walked into her room, slamming the door behind her. Lizzie looked at Claire, her lip trembling, but she said nothing, just stood up and followed her sister. Claire was left alone at the table, her hands clenched into fists, tears streaming down her cheeks. She wanted to scream, to beg them to understand, but she knew it was useless. They were children, and she was an adult who should have protected them, but instead she had destroyed their world. Alex had moved to a small house on the other side of town. Claire had seen him only briefly when he'd picked up the girls for the weekend. He was polite but cold, his words short and his eyes empty. He didn't talk about Northwind, he didn't mention Ryan, but Claire felt his pain in every gesture, in every silence. He was rebuilding his life, starting a small engineering firm, renting a cozy house with a wooden porch where Lizzie liked to play with the neighbor's puppy. Claire had heard from Marge, their nanny, that he looked better, that he smiled when he talked about work, that he'd started meeting coworkers in the evenings. It was like a knife in her heart, the thought that he was moving on while she was stuck in the ruins of their past. She tried to move on her own. She went back to her job as an interior designer, took on a few projects to keep herself busy. But every night, when she returned to an empty house, her thoughts returned to Northwind, to Ryan. She shouldn't think about him, but she couldn't stop. His smile, his ease, his touch were like bright flashes in the gray fog of her life. She knew it was wrong, that it was a mistake, but in those moments in his cabin, she felt alive, wanted, free. One day, on impulse, she wrote to him. It was a short message, sent through an old email he used at the station. "How are you? Still digging rocks?" She waited for a reply, her heart pounding, but it took 2 days for it to arrive, dry and curt. "I'm fine. Working in Colorado. Good luck, Claire." It was a slap in the face. For Ryan, it had ended on the island, the moment the plane left Iqaluit. He had no attachment to her, no desire for more. What had been a whirlwind of emotion for her was just an episode for him, a fleeting adventure in the icy wilderness. Claire deleted his contact, her fingers shaking as she pressed the button. She didn't text again. But every time her phone buzzed, she found herself hoping to see his name. The divorce was finalized quickly, with little argument. Alex asked for anything other than joint custody of the girls. The judge, an older woman with tired eyes, signed the papers, and Claire felt her life officially split into before and after. The girls stayed with her, but they spent every other weekend with Alex. Claire tried to make their home warm, to fill it with laughter, but every time Sarah and Lizzie returned from their father's, they brought with them a piece of his new life tales of his house, his new dog, the pizza he made them. Claire listened, smiling, but inside her heart was aching. One evening, while Lizzie was drawing at the kitchen table and Sarah was sitting with her headphones in, Claire decided to speak. "Girls," she said, her voice soft but shaky, "I know you're mad at me, and I don't blame you, but I want you to know that I love you, and I'll do anything to make you happy." Lizzie looked at her, her pencil hovering over the paper. "Do you love Daddy?" she asked, her voice so quiet Claire barely heard her. "Yes," Claire said, and it was true, despite everything. "But sometimes love isn't enough." Sarah took off her headphones, her gaze sharp. "Then why did you do it?" she asked, her voice full of pain. "Why did you ruin everything?" Claire opened her mouth, but the word stuck. She wanted to explain, to say that she was lost, that she was searching for herself, but how could she explain that to a child? Instead, she simply said, "I made a mistake, Sarah, and I'll live with it for the rest of my life." Sarah stood up, her eyes shining with tears. "That doesn't fix anything," she said, and went into her room. Lizzie looked at Claire, her lips trembling, but she said nothing, just went back to her drawing. Claire sat on the porch, looking up at the stars, which were as bright as they had been on Northwind, but now seemed cold and distant. She thought about how things might have been different if she had stopped, if she had not given in to temptation, if she had talked to Alex sooner. But it was too late now. Alex was building a new life, the girls were learning to live without him, and she was alone, with guilt like a shadow following her everywhere. She knew she had to move on. She signed up for yoga classes, started seeing friends she hadn't seen in 6 months. But every step was a struggle. She wanted to be the mother her daughters deserved, a woman who could look in the mirror without shame. But all she saw was Claire, who had destroyed everything she loved. Autumn in Minneapolis was mild, with golden leaves falling on the sidewalks and the smell of pumpkin pie wafting through the open windows of the cafe. Claire Carter sat by the window of a small corner establishment, her fingers fiddling nervously with the edge of her napkin. She had chosen this place for a reason. It was where she and Alex had once shared coffee in the first months of their relationship, laughing at his clumsy attempts at ordering triple shot lattes and arguing about what movie to watch that evening. Now, a year after their divorce, this cafe was the only place that felt like neutral ground, where she could try to bridge the chasm that separated them. She called him last week, her voice shaking as she dialed the number she still knew by heart. "Alex, it's me," she said, trying to sound light. "Want to meet up? Just talk like friends, about girls, about life." He paused, his breath barely audible over the phone, and Claire thought he'd say no. But he agreed, his voice even almost businesslike. "Okay, name a place." Now she waited, her eyes scanning the street, where people were hurrying about their business, cars honking in traffic. Claire smoothed her hair, her fingers touching the silver bracelet that Lizzie had given her for her birthday. She tried to look composed, but inside her heart was pounding, as if she were back on the Northwind, standing outside Ryan's cabin. She didn't know what she expected from this meeting, but she hoped that she could at least say what she hadn't said a year ago. Alex walked into the cafe exactly on time, his steps confident, his face calm, almost impenetrable. He looked different, a new dark blue sweater, neatly trimmed hair, a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Claire felt a pang of pain. He looked good, better than she remembered, as if a year without her had erased the shadows from his face. "Hello," he said, sitting down opposite her. His voice was polite but cold, like the October wind outside. "Are you okay?" "Yes," Claire replied, her fingers tightening on the napkin. "Thank you for coming." He nodded, ordering a black coffee from the waitress as she approached. Claire took her latte, her hands shaking as she lifted the cup to her lips. "How are the girls?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the cup, as if he were avoiding looking at her. "Okay," she said, trying to smile. "Sarah finished the semester with straight A's. She's in the book club now, writing stories. Lizzie still wants a dog, but I'm holding the line for now." Alex smiled slightly, and for a second his face softened. "She always wanted a puppy," he said. "I bought her a plush spaniel, but she said it didn't count." Claire laughed, hers weak but genuine. "Yeah, she told me that too. But they miss you, Alex. Especially Lizzie. She's wondering when you're coming next." "I'll take them for the weekend," he answered, his voice even. "We'll go to the zoo. Sarah will grumble, of course, but Lizzie will be delighted." Claire nodded, her fingers tightening around her cup. She wanted to say something else, something that would bring them back to what had been, but the words stuck. Instead, she asked, "What about you? How are you, Alex?" He shrugged, his gaze sliding to the window. "Work is going on. The company is growing. They took on a couple of new projects. Life moves on." She saw his fingers brush against his wedding ring, or rather, where it had once been. His finger was empty now, and it was like a blow. Claire swallowed, her voice quieter. "I heard you were seeing someone. Marge mentioned it." Alex looked at her, his eyes narrowing but not looking away. "Yes," he said simply. "Her name is Abby. She's an architect, working with us on a new project." Claire felt her chest tighten, but she forced herself to smile. "That's good," she said, though each word was like a mouthful of acid. "I'm glad you're happy." He didn't answer, just nodded, his face unreadable. Claire took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the napkin so tightly it began to tear. "Alex," she began, her voice shaking, "I want to say I'm sorry for everything. For Northwind, for what I did. I didn't mean to ruin us. I was lost, but that's no excuse. I want you to know I'm sorry." He looked at her, his eyes cold as the ice on the island. "I know, Claire," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "You said it before, but it doesn't change what happened. You made a choice, and I made mine." Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I forgave you," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Back in Seattle. Why can't you forgive me?" He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tightening around his cup. "Because I can't forget," he said, and there was a pain in his voice that he had hidden for so long. "I see you with him every time I close my eyes. I see the way you laughed, the way you looked at him. I can't live with this, Claire. I've tried, but I can't." She nodded, her throat tightening. "I understand," she whispered. "I just wanted to try, as friends." He looked at her, and for a second she thought she saw the old warmth in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. "Friends," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Maybe someday, but not now." He finished his coffee, stood up, and put on his coat. "I'll call the girls," he said. "See you there, Claire." She watched him leave, his back straight, his steps confident. The cafe door rang shut behind him, and Claire was left alone, her fingers still clutching the torn napkin. She wanted to scream, to cry, but instead she just sat there, staring at her empty cup. The waitress came over, asking if she wanted more coffee, but Claire shook her head, her voice weak. "No, thank you. I'm leaving." At home, Claire sat on the porch, her breath curling in the cool air. The sky was full of stars, as bright as they had been on the north wind, but now they seemed distant, foreign. She held an old photo album she'd found in a box in the garage. The pages were dog-eared, the photos slightly faded, but each one was a stab in the heart. There was her and Alex at their wedding, her white dress shining, his smile so wide it seemed it could light up the world. There was Sarah, a newborn in a tiny pink cap, asleep in his arms. There was Lizzie, running across the lawn with a kite, her laughter captured in motion. Claire flipped through the pages, her fingers shaking. She stopped at a photograph of the four of them sitting on this very porch, eating ice cream. Summer, 3 years ago, before Seattle, before Northwind, before everything that had torn their lives apart. She looked at her eyes in that photograph, happy, carefree, and she didn't recognize herself. That Claire was gone, leaving only the woman who was still on that cold island, inside herself, frozen in her mistakes. Sarah and Lizzie were different now. Sarah was quieter, but her anger was fading, replaced by a tired conciliation. She would sit with Claire at dinner sometimes, talking about school, about her stories, but her eyes were still wary. Lizzie was softer, her hugs more frequent, but Claire knew that her youngest daughter was still looking for her father in every phone call, every visit. They had grown up too fast, and Claire blamed herself for it. She had heard from Marge that Alex was happy. Abby, his new woman, was kind, smart, and loved girls. They went hiking together, baked cookies, and laughed at silly movies. Claire wanted to hate her, but she couldn't. She had seen Lizzie beam when she talked about her, and Sarah, though she grumbled, mentioned her with a small smile. Alex had found what he had lost with Claire, and it was like the last nail in her heart. Claire closed the book, her fingers lingering on the cover. She remembered Ryan, his easy smile, his touch that had made her feel alive for a moment. But he had been right not to answer her again. What had been on the Northwind was still there, under the ice, like the fossils he had studied. And she was still there, in that cabin, in that storm, in that moment when she had crossed the line. She looked up at the stars, her breath shaking. The house behind her was warm, full of her daughter's voices, but inside she was as cold as an Arctic night. She knew she had to move on, for Sarah, for Lizzie, for herself. But as she sat on the porch, the sketchbook in her lap, she was still on the island where it all began and ended. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.